Hello and welcome back to another Dare to Game video. Today we're playing Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and we're going to be ranking all of the stances in the game. So there are 5 different stances, which is basically just different ways to wield your lightsaber. You know, for lack of a better term, they use stances, which is interesting to me. But anyway, we're going to be ranking all 5 of them, and I'm not going to pussyfoot around with some tier list. I'm not afraid of backlash. I'm going to give you definitive rankings, so 5 being the worst, 1 being the best for each category. We've got 4 categories. We have the overall best, which we'll talk about at the end, and then we've got, well, before that I should say, we've got the ease of use, so which ones are the easiest to use. So the best for that one will be the one that's the easiest to use, and the worst will be the one that's the most difficult to use, or the difficult to master. Then we'll do best against mobs, so that'll be both against your basic enemies, your stormtroopers, your droids, whatever, and also a consideration for groups, since, you know, the smaller mob type enemies typically come in groups. So that'll be the second ranking we go over to determine what's the best, and the third one will be the best in boss fights, so against your single, large, powerful enemies. So there will be those 3 rankings, and then compiling them to have the best ranking. So let's just get down to it right away. So we're going to start with ease of use, and the worst stance for ease of use, based on all the testing I've done, the polling I've done, all that sort of stuff, it seems to be widely agreed upon that the worst one is the Crossguard stance. This one, without a doubt, takes the most time, effort, and sweatiness to try and get ultimately proficient with. It's got these long, slow swings with huge interruptible windups. It's somewhat inaccurate. It relies on brute force. It's got a lot of issues to it that make it very, very unforgiving. That being said, you know, it does have certain perks to it, like dealing high damage and everything, but most people, myself included, don't find that to be a good trade-off. It's definitely the most difficult stance to master in this game. Now, I'm not saying you can't blunder your way through any encounter with this stance at some point in the game without skill, but if you actually want to be a master and be proficient with the weapon, the hardest one to learn is the Crossguard stance. So it takes the number 5 spot on the ease of use list. At number 4, we have the blaster stance, and now this one is a different beast than the Crossguard stance. So this one is actually relatively simple and straightforward to use. It's just that it's difficult to get to a point where it's as effective or more effective than the other stances on this list. So this one is a combination of a single blade in one hand, where you have a Makashi style combat, which is basically just a lot of thrusting and parry and jabbing. So this is the Count Dooku style combat, and it can be useful, but it is pretty limiting, and it makes it so your range of motion is very restricted. And then in your offhand, you have the blaster, which you don't have unlimited ammo or ammo packs. You have to actually deal damage with your saber to refill it. So it's a complex stance, which means that yes, you can use it with basically no skill to some effect, and maybe even survive the majority of firefights. But the problem with it is, if you want it to be as effective as a single blade or a saber staff or something like that, it requires a lot of technique and a lot of switching back and forth between longer range blaster attacks and close range saber attacks. So for that reason, it takes the number 4 spot for ease of use, because even though you can just ignite and go with it, it does take a lot of practice to get anywhere near what I would call good with it. So the blaster takes the number 4 spot for ease of use. At number 3 for ease of use, we have the double blade, or the saber staff. Now this one is where we're getting into the territory of all of them I consider to be relatively easy to use, but they just have slight edges over the others. So the saber staff is relatively intuitive. It's a fast moving stance. It's good for crowd control. Its only major weakness is against single opponents. It's not unusable against single opponents, you know, as a dueling stance, but it is one of the weaker, if not the weakest ones for that setting, which means that you do have to compensate. If you want to strictly use the stance, you do have to compensate for that, either by a lot of dodging, maneuvering, jumping around, and it turns most fights into long drawn out things, or you'll have to supplement it with a separate stance to try and fill in for that weakness. But other than that, it is a very easy stance to use. It's high speed, rapid, very mobile. It's got a lot of special combos and moves that make it extremely useful. And I find that just overall, most people can try using this one without an insane amount of effort, and if you put any sort of time into it at all, you will become pretty proficient with it. So the double-bladed stance takes the number 3 spot right in the middle. At number 2, we've got our second most intuitive stance, the dual-wielding stance. So this one's based on Ahsoka Tano, and it is pretty dang straightforward. Now, the reason for that is mostly because it's just very similar with some small changes to the number 1 spot on this list. It's very, very good against single enemies. It can be adapted to use against multiple enemies, but that is certainly its greatest weakness. But the nice thing about it is it's the single easiest and, like, quickest to learn how to be very good at blocking and parrying to make it so that you actually do not take a lot of damage with this stance. That allows you to control the battlefield and maneuver very easily because you're not taking damage, getting staggered, and getting killed. So that is why I put the dual wield stance in front of the Saber staff stance for ease of use. It just is very intuitive and very forgiving. So that's why dual wielding takes the number 2 spot for ease of use. Finally, at number 1 for ease of use, we have the single Saber stance. This one is the OG stance. Most Jedi and Sith use it throughout all of Star Wars, and I believe canonically it's the one that makes the absolute most sense for Cal Kestis, just given his size, stature, species, and style of combat. That being said, it is also the easiest to use in the game. It's the most forgiving. It has absolutely no weaknesses. It's very good against bosses. It's very good against mob enemies. It's good against groups. It's good against single opponents. There's no weakness. It's a jack of all trades and a master of none. So the problem with it is just that it won't excel in any one area past the best in class for any of the other stances. But because of that, I find it just has the most balanced experience, and like I said, is the most forgiving for any user. And if you practice with it enough, it can become extremely powerful. So you can actually master this one to a point where you're very, very effective against any enemy type. So yes, for ease of use, the number 1 spot goes to the single-bladed stance. Alright, moving on to our second ranking, we have the ones that are best against mobs. And again, this is a consideration of basic enemy types like stormtroopers, droids, whatever, in the single sense, but also against groups. So we take both of those into consideration in this ranking. So again, 5 is the worst, 1 is the best. Let's start off with number 5, which is the Crossguard stance. And I know a lot of sweaty fanboys out there are going to be real upset about this, but the Crossguard stance is the single worst stance against mob-type enemies and against groups. And the reason for this is pretty obvious. This one is a powerful stance. It's great at dealing high damage for 1 hit. The problem is it's extremely slow. The animations are the slowest out of any stance in the game, and therefore the easiest to interrupt. And it just has way too many exploitable weaknesses that even low damage, quick hitting enemies can really take advantage of and just mob you into a corner. So even worse than dual wielding, I find the Crossguard stance to be the single worst one against A, basic enemies, just because it's a waste of effort, and B, especially against groups. So that's why the Crossguard stance takes the number 5 spot for use against mobs. Coming in at number 4, we have the obvious choice, since I already mentioned it, and that one is dual wielding. So dual wielding is like the single best stance against a single opponent. It's excellent at dueling, but it's really, really bad against groups. Like I said, it's not as bad against groups as the Crossguard stance is, in my opinion, but it does have just a tremendous amount of weaknesses as far as groups otherwise go. And that being said, like I said, I still enjoy using it, like I do with all of these stances, and it can be made effective, but I find that unless you're going against a single opponent, and typically a boss, the dual wield stance has a lot of weaknesses that can be easily exploited. It's only better than the Crossguard stance because A, it's faster and therefore more forgiving, and you can come out of any combo at any point with the dual wield stance to parry or block, which makes it a lot more forgiving in that manner too. So the dual wield stance takes the number 4 spot as far as mob ability goes. At number 3, we've got the blaster stance, and this one is your single blade Makashi paired with a blaster. So this one, it's not bad against low-level enemies like stormtroopers and droids that you can just blast and kill with 1 shot against them. It's very effective. But where we run into problems with the blaster stance is our group ability, because A, you'll run out of blaster shots pretty dang quick, and against any stronger enemies, it's going to take multiple shots to kill them, even if you spec into it as aggressively as possible. And then when you're left down to just Saber, the Saber stance itself is not that good. It does powerful enough attacks given the speed of them, but the problem is it really limits your range of movement, and I find that every single time I get backed into a corner with this stance against a group, I almost always die. So the blaster stance takes the number 3 spot because it's slightly better than the dual wielder crossguard, but is still middle of the road in that there are a lot of weaknesses that can be exploited about this stance, and the 2 that take the number 1 and 2 spot are a lot better against mob enemies. Alright, for our number 2 stance against mobs, we've got the OG stance, the single saber. And now this one is, like I've said, just an extremely versatile stance that really has no weaknesses, but for that has no great strength. But that being said, it is effective against single opponents and effective against groups, which is going to make it rank high here, because your basic opponents, your stormtroopers, your droids, your whatever, your bedlam raiders, are not going to be heavy hitters. They're usually not extremely fast moving, and so you don't need any great specialization to take them on. All you need is a saber that can handle it, and a stance that promotes fast and forgiving enough movement, so you're not getting backed into a corner and piss pounded into the ground. So the single saber stance takes the number 2 spot against mobs. Finally, at number 1, we've got the absolute best one against groups, the saber staff. And now this one just really speaks for itself in why it excels against groups. When you're swinging with this one, you're constantly putting a shield around yourself, because the one blade you have facing forward to deal damage is always complemented by the blade that is behind you or to the side of you, which is interrupting attacks from other enemies and dealing damage as well. So there are very few weaknesses that the saber staff has, and those that it has are relatively difficult to exploit. And so I find this one to be the single best against basic enemies, even if you're facing them. Like I said, alone, I would rather have the single-bladed stance, but with any group of them at all, the saber staff just really does its heavy lifting. So as far as the ranking for best against mob goes, the saber staff takes the number 1 spot. Finally, for our itemized rankings, we have the best in boss fights. So this is the ranking against bosses, you know, the big enemies with lots of health that deal lots of damage and require a specialized fighting form. So all the stances are not equal against them, and some of them are much worse than others. So the number 5 spot in boss fights I actually give to the blaster stance. This one is terrible against bosses, and I find that's because the blaster just doesn't do enough damage to be all that useful against bosses, and the lightsaber itself has such a limiting stance that it just really falls victim to most bosses. The only exception to this is the bounty hunter bosses with jetpacks, because the ability to blast them out of the sky with the blaster is very, very useful. But, you know, utilizing force pull or saber throw, you can do the same thing with other stances, and don't have nearly as much of a weakness with the saber. So the blaster stance takes the number 5 spot in boss fights. The number 4 spot goes to the double-bladed stance, and the reason for that is because even though it's really good against groups and can be very adaptable against single opponent mobbed enemies, it just doesn't do that much damage. So each single blade strike is relatively low damage, and given the fact that against a lot of boss enemies in the game, you won't actually have the freedom to complete a whole lot of the combos, especially with the longer animations that this one has. I find that the double-bladed stance is weak against single opponents, and if you give that opponent extremely high damage and a ton of health, that makes it infinitely worse. So the double-bladed stance, despite being very fun to use and extremely good in groups, is really bad against bosses, and that's why it takes the number 4 spot in this ranking. So coming in at number 3, some might call it the average, we have our Jack of all trades and Master of none, the single-bladed stance. And now this should be really no surprise, this one is perfectly average in a lot of ways. I've defeated plenty of bosses with it, and I've also struggled with some bosses with it, because basically for my whole first playthrough, the single-blade stance was my primary stance. And it can be used very effectively, and like I said, I've defeated lots of bosses with it, but it has a lot of drawbacks in that it doesn't really specialize in any specific area. So it's balanced, it's forgiving, but it doesn't really pack the punch that some of the other ones do, and it's not as fast as some of the other ones are. For a middle-of-the-road stance that's easy to learn, yes, I recommend it, but in a boss fight, a lot of times, a more specialized saber is going to be a better choice. So, the single-blade stance takes the number 3 spot right in the middle. At the number 2 spot, our second one against most bosses, we've got the Crossguard stance. And now this one is complicated to use. So like I said, it's the worst one for ease of use, so if you're bad with it, I don't recommend it for boss fights, because fighting against a boss isn't going to be any easier than regular enemies. That being said, I'm assuming you're good with any of these stances for this ranking. So if you're very good with the Crossguard stance, I find it is the second best overall against the vast majority of bosses in the game. It does very high damage, it's very good at parrying even stronger attacks. You can have some really special abilities that will really power you up. So one of the things that I like to do with this one against, say, ranged boss enemies, so bounty hunters and stuff like that, the Haxian Brood, is that charged shot deflection that you can do with the Crossguard stance that is so useful. So yes, you can't shoot them with your own blaster, but if they shoot at you, you can parry it just the right moment and shoot back a charge shot, which will deal a crazy amount of damage and knock them out of the air. And against larger beast type enemies, it's extremely good because as long as you make sure you don't get hit, you can land powerful single strike attacks and then back away and whittle down their health pretty dang quickly. So the Crossguard stance, for all of its weaknesses, is still very good against bosses. So it takes the number 2 spot. So finally, the best stance against boss fights, or in boss fights I should say, is obviously the dual wield stance. So like I said, this one is arguably the best single dueling lightsaber stance in the game, and given that most boss fights are only against one opponent, that means that this one just really is extremely effective. The only caveat I would have to that is that if you're going up against, say, a large beast like a bile maw, I think is what they're called, in that instance, I'd say the Crossguard is a better one. But against all of your humanoid enemies, which is most of the bosses in the game, the dual wield stance is simply better. It's just an all-around better stance that keeps you safe and helps you deal a tremendous amount of damage. So that's why the dual wield stance takes the number 1 spot for boss fights. And so finally moving on to our ultimate ranking, which is a compilation of those first 3 that we went over. For the all-around best ones, we'll move into them now. So at the number 5 spot, being the absolute worst and only gaining 7 points across all of the testing and ratings that I put it through, we have the Blaster stance. It is objectively the worst stance in the entire game. Yes, it has specific strengths and very obvious and exploitable weaknesses, but it, like I said, when ranked against basic enemies, bosses, and for ease of use, it ranked so low on average that it just did not garner many points. So like I said, at 7 points, the Blaster stance is the worst one available. At number 4, so the second worst, or 4th best, depending how you want to look at it and what you want to tell yourself to justify it, we have the Crossguard Saber with only 8 points. So this one is only slightly better than the Blaster stance in all of the ratings that I was able to come up with. And honestly, it makes sense. So what this game comes down to in a lot of combat is outlasting your enemy, because you need to make sure you are seizing opportunities in windows to deal damage without taking damage. And the Crossguard one is just not good at that. It takes way too much time, skill, and effort to get to a point where you can adequately fight against a lot of enemy types in this game with the Crossguard stance, whereas you can pretty much instantly do that with a lot of the better stances in this game. And so for that reason alone, the Crossguard stance takes the number 4th spot. I don't care if you like it or if you personally got really good with it, just objectively speaking, it is one of the worst stances you can choose in the game. So that's number 4, the Crossguard. Let's move on to number 3. And at number 3, we're moving into territory of what I consider stances that I quite enjoy, but just objectively speaking, had to be ranked lower. So at number 3, we have the dual wielding stance. And so this one is extremely good against most bosses. It's great against any single opponent in the game, but it does have a relatively large weakness, and that is against groups. And so that's why it was not able to edge out to the number 2 spot, and why it sits at number 3 with only 14 points. That being said, like I've said, at number 3 you've moved into territory of ones that I consider to be genuinely good, and with enough practice, the ones that could easily be exceptional, and you could demonstrate total mastery of the lightsaber art. The dual wield stance takes the number 3 spot and puts it right in the middle. So let's move on to number 2. At number 2 for our overall ranking, we have one that was very close to number 3 but edges it out ever so slightly. So number 2 is the Saber staff, or the double-bladed lightsaber. So this stand is one of, if not the absolute best against groups of enemies, which is the vast majority of combat in this game. It's super good at deflecting bolts, it's really good at protecting you from being interrupted, so that you can actually finish the vast majority of its combos and its longer animations that many of the other stances just get interrupted way too often. You're able to do a ton ton of DPS with this stance, and if you learn how to use it adequately enough, you will find it to be pretty dang effective against all enemy types, including bosses, even though that is its weakest area. So like I said, the Saber Staff is just overall objectively very, very good, and that's why it takes the number 2 spot with 14 points, slightly edging out dual wielding. Finally, at number 1, the one that is the only one left and should be fairly obvious, our Jack of all trades and master of none, the single-bladed lightsaber stance. This one is just the easiest to learn. It's easily the most versatile. There are no enemies that it's particularly bad against. It has no exploitable weaknesses. So while it may not excel as being the hardest hitting stance, or the fastest stance, or the absolute best at parrying, it's very high on all of those rankings. So for that reason alone, if you're choosing a primary stance, I have no better recommendation than the single-bladed stance. That being said, you can obviously supplement it very well with any of the other stances, but I find that the single-bladed stance is the best one to make your primary stance because of the fact that it has no exploitable weaknesses. So, if this video was enjoyable or entertaining, please leave a like, comment, whatever. Maybe leave down below what your favorite stance is. If you disagree, like I said, that really is tough because this is an objectively accurate list, and so therefore you're wrong. But you can leave your arguments down in the comment section below and I'll check them out. With all that in mind, thanks a ton for watching and have a nice day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching another Dare to Game video. If you like this video, please leave a like and a comment. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. If you like my content and would like to support this channel, consider becoming a member today for as little as $1.99 a month. It makes a huge difference. But in any case, thanks for watching and have a nice day. I'll see you next time.